It begins with silence, not the gentle silence of night, but the kind that follows a scream, the kind that clings to walls after something has been ripped from them. 3 women, gone in the dark, as if erased by a hand too powerful to resist. Suzie Streeter, Stacy McCall, Sherrill Levitt, a daughter, a friend, a mother. June 6, 1992. Springfield, Missouri, a night of graduation parties, of laughter, of photographs still curling in forgotten albums. It was supposed to be a beginning. It became an ending. Suzie and Stacy, teenagers glowing with youth, had drifted from house to house that night, celebrating the close of one chapter and the opening of another. But somewhere between champagne toasts and the exhaustion of dawn, they chose a quieter path, to sleep at Suzie's home, a 1-story brick house on East Delmar Street. Inside, Sherrill Levitt, Suzie's mother, was waiting, settling into her own quiet evening. 3 women, under one roof, unaware that by morning, that roof would be nothing more than an empty shell, because the next day their cars were in the driveway, their purses inside, their cigarettes untouched, but the women themselves had vanished. No blood, no broken glass, no signs of struggle, just absence. The house felt staged, beds neatly made, makeup on counters, a coffee cup in the sink, as though time had stopped mid-gesture and then been erased. The only fracture, a shattered porch light, its glass swept away by friends who thought they were helping, unknowing they were burying evidence with each stroke of a broom. And so, from the very first morning, the story of the Springfield Three began not with discovery, but with erasure, a crime scene compromised, a silence sealed, a vanishing too clean to be chance. And what was left behind was not just an empty home, but the shadow of something vast, something orchestrated, something that felt less like crime and more like ritual. Because disappearances like this don't happen by accident, they happen by design. The neighbors remember the night as ordinary. No screams that pierced through sleep, no pounding at doors, no chaos spilling into the street, only quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that conceals precision, that cloaks intent, that whispers of hands moving in shadows, while the world remains blind. Suzie and Stacy had danced through the night of celebration, faces flushed with joy, eager for the next chapter of life. But celebration breeds vulnerability. Youth carries trust, and trust is the sharpest weapon. They should have been safe. 2 young women falling asleep in a familiar home, with a mother inside, the world of suburbia wrapped around them like a promise. But that promise cracked before sunrise. At 5 a.m., a neighbor reported seeing Suzie's car, shifted strangely in the driveway, backed in rather than pulled forward, a detail too subtle for coincidence. Another spoke of a scream in the night, a sound so faint it was dismissed, because people dismiss what disturbs them, until it is too late. The phone rang inside the house. Obscene voices crawled through the wires. Sexual, deranged, mocking. Were they taunts from the predator, or vultures circling tragedy? Either way, the timing was cruel. The calls came while friends searched the house, while hope still lingered and innocence had not yet calcified into dread. But the glass was gone, the footprints erased, the fingerprints smudged by hands that cared too much, and the stage was swept clean before the actors of law ever arrived. 3 women, vanished from a house that looked untouched. How does a predator remove 3 lives at once? Without blood, without sound, without a single neighbor fully waking, unless the women opened the door themselves, unless the face outside was one they trusted, unless the hand that led them into the dark was familiar. This was not random violence, not a stranger kicking in a door. This was betrayal, wearing a mask of safe tie. The kind of betrayal that destroys more than lives. It dismantles the illusion of security itself, because if 3 women can vanish from their own home without a trace, then safety is the greatest lie we've ever told ourselves. And in Springfield that night, the lie was exposed. By morning, the house on East Delmar Street was already a grave of silence. Friends arrived expecting to collect Stacy for a pool day. Instead, they stepped into absence. Cars sat obediently in the driveway, keys on the counter, purses untouched, even cigarettes waiting to be lit. But there were no women, only the strange feeling of a stage left behind by actors who vanished mid-scene. The beds were neatly made, as though the night had never happened, as though sleep itself had been erased. The friends called out names, but the walls only echoed back emptiness. Then came the phone calls, obscene, twisted, a male voice dripping filth, dialing into the void of the missing women's home. Not once, but multiple times. Were they random vultures drawn to tragedy, or was it the predator still circling the house, listening to the panic of those inside, feeding on their fear? The timing was too sharp to dismiss, too cruel to be chance. And yet the calls were never traced, never recorded, lost to negligence, lost to time. The glass from the porch light, the single fracture in an otherwise pristine scene, had already been swept away by helpful hands, destroying the only visible clue every action meant to comfort, instead carved holes in the evidence, as though the crime itself demanded silence, even from those who wanted truth. When police finally arrived, they found not a crime scene, but a contaminated memory. Dozens of people had walked through, touched doors, moved objects, even cleaned, the blueprint of abduction. Smudged by well-meaning fingers, the house was not locked down. It was left open, exposed, polluted. And in that failure, the chance of solving the disappearance was crippled from the very first hours. Suzie, Stacy, Sherrill. 3 women, gone without a struggle, gone without a scream that anyone would admit hearing. The perfect vanishing act. But perfection in crime is not born from impulse. It is born from planning. And someone, somewhere, had planned this night in detail, because you cannot erase 3 women without leaving chaos. Unless the erasure itself was the point. The Springfield Three did not just disappear. They were removed, methodically, deliberately. And removal this clean always means someone wanted them silenced. Forever. Silence can be louder than screams. When investigators entered the house, they found nothing that spoke of violence, nothing that screamed of intrusion. Instead, they found a void, no broken locks, no shattered doors, no overturned furniture. The house was calm, too calm, like a stage set after the play has ended. But the actors never returned to bow. The purses were there, the cigarettes were there, the cars were there, the essentials of life, the small anchors of routine, all left behind. What thief leaves wallets untouched? What predator abandons the tools of escape? What kidnapper removes 3 women, and yet forgets to erase the trail of their belongings, unless the belongings were meant to be left, as part of the message, the single broken element, the porch light, swept away before it could speak, before it could whisper whether it shattered in struggle or in silence. And with its removal, the crime became cleaner, the shadows deeper, the trail colder. Police knocked on doors. Neighbors shook their heads. No. They had not seen anything. No. They had not heard anything. Except one faint scream in the dark, too distant, too fragile to trust memory. The illusion of suburbia remained intact. Lawns were still trimmed. Dogs still barked. Sprinklers still hissed across grass, while 3 women were swallowed whole. That is the horror of it. The erasure was so clean that even those next door did not know until it was already too late. Imagine it. You sleep in your bed, your neighbor sleeps in theirs, and in the space between you, 3 lives are taken, erased so perfectly that even the night air does not shift. This was not chaos. This was control, a control that moved invisibly, with the certainty of someone who knew the terrain, knew the timing, knew how to erase without leaving scars. It is here the case begins to transform from crime into legend, because legends are not born from what we know. They are born from what we never find, and from this moment on, the Springfield Three belonged not to Springfield, but to silence itself. Every mystery casts shadows, and in those shadows live suspects. Suzie Streeter had broken ties with men who didn't want to let go. A former boyfriend, obsessive, possessive. The kind of man who confuses love with ownership. Others whispered of a darker thread. Suzie had been connected to a criminal case, a case that carried weight, a case where her testimony could have cracked more than one life in half. And when witnesses become inconvenient, they often vanish, not as punishment, but as warning. What better way to silence a voice than to erase not only the speaker, but her mother and her closest friend? Collateral damage, transformed into permanent silence. The theories gathered like vultures over a corpse. Some said the abduction was personal, a jealous lover, a spurned man who couldn't let go. Others said it was business, that Suzie knew something, saw something, spoke too much, and the price for truth was death. The reality is colder, because the disappearance wasn't sloppy, it wasn't frenzied rage. It was precise. 3 women removed, 3 sets of memories erased, in a way that suggested planning, timing, calculation. This was not one man in a burst of violence. This was method. This was orchestration. And into that silence stepped a name. Robert Craig Cox. A convicted kidnapper. A man already linked to murder, living in Springfield at the very time of the disappearance. A man who years later would look into the eyes of journalists and lawmen alike and say he knew the truth, that the Springfield Three were dead, that their bodies would never be found, that the case would never close. Was he lying? Was he toying with hope? Or was he revealing the truth? In the only way monsters know how, by holding it just out of reach. The question is not whether Cox was capable. The question is whether he acted alone or whether he was the mask for something larger, something that demanded silence and chose 3 womb, and to deliver it. Because in the end, the disappearance of the Springfield Three feels less like a crime of passion and more like a message carved into reality itself. A message that says, those who know too much do not speak twice. Robert Craig Cox, a name that drips like poison through the Springfield mystery, a man who already walked in shadows, a convicted kidnapper, a suspected murderer, a predator who lived in Springfield in the exact year the women vanished. Coincidence or inevitability? He was the kind of man who left scars wherever he stepped, the kind of man who turned silence into theater and pain into performance. Years after the women disappeared, Cox spoke with reporters, with investigators, with anyone willing to listen. He said the women were dead. He said their bodies would never be found. He said the case would never be solved. And when asked for proof, he smiled. When pressed for details, he said it wasn't the right time. Imagine that. A man dangling truth over grieving families, like meat over starving dogs, knowing they would leap for scraps, knowing they would never be fed. But here lies the deeper question. Was Cox simply a manipulator, feeding his ego on the torment of others? Or was he speaking the truth, buried in riddles, because that was the only way he could release it? Every investigator who looked into him knew one thing. He had the capacity. He had the darkness. He had the history. But capacity is not proof, and proof never came. Still, his words infected the case, turned every lead into an echo of his taunts, every dead end into the shape of his grin. If he was lying, he succeeded in making himself the center of gravity, pulling all attention into his orbit. If he was telling the truth, then the families already had their answer without the closure of graves. Either way, Cox weaponized silence. He became the puppeteer of grief, holding invisible strings that made the case dance in circles. And through him, the story of the Springfield Three shifted from tragedy to something darker. Because when a man like Cox says you will never find the bodies, you begin to wonder, not just about his involvement, but about the possibility of a network, a machine of silence, bigger than one man, bigger than Springfield. And that possibility, that there was a system behind the erasure, is the truth most fear to consider, because systems do not make mistakes, they make disappearances. There are crimes of impulse, and there are crimes of order. The disappearance of the Springfield Three does not feel like impulse. It feels like order. It feels like ritual. Think about it. 3 women removed from a suburban home, without forced entry, without chaos, without evidence. That is not the work of rage. That is the work of planning. And planning requires more than one man. A single predator can stalk, can strike, can kill. But to abduct and erase 3 women at once, to leave no blood, no struggle, no sound, to wake a neighborhood, that is something else entirely. It feels like orchestration, a design carried out with precision and discipline. Theories began to grow like weeds in the cracks of silence. Some said Suzie knew too much, that she had been marked as a witness, that her testimony could unravel men tied to deeper networks of crime. If that is true, then her disappearance was not personal. It was institutional. Because when systems fear exposure, they do not simply intimidate, they erase. Not just the witness, but everything tethered to them, every voice, every life, every thread that might pull the secret into light. That is why Sherrill was taken. That is why Stacy was taken, not because they were targets, but because they were proximity. Collateral in a system that values silence above innocence. And when silence is enforced on that scale, it feels less like murder and more like control. Because abduction is not only about removal, it is about power. The demonstration that certain people can vanish, and nothing will be done. No one will be punished. No one will even leave a trace. It is the psychology of dominance, the shadow language of institutions that operate beyond law. And in Springfield that night, it was spoken fluently, which is why, decades later, you are still hearing whispers instead of answers, because if this was just one man, there would have been evidence. If this was just rage, there would have been bodies. But there was neither. Only silence, only absence, only the mark of something vast, something that hides behind ordinary streets and uses them as hunting grounds. Days after the vanishing, whispers surfaced of a sighting. 2 young women seen in a local parking garage, nervous, silent, eyes darting like trapped animals. An older man escorted them, guiding them with subtle pressure, the kind of control that doesn't need chains, only fear. Witnesses swore. The girls resembled Suzie and Stacy, the missing teens everyone in Springfield was already searching for. But the sighting was fleeting. No names, no photos, no cameras in the garage that night. Just memory. Fragile, unreliable, but haunting, imagine it. Suzie and Stacy alive days, after the world declared them gone, moving through concrete shadows, under the gaze of a man who held the leash of their silence. What if that moment was the last chance to intervene, the last crack in the prison of secrecy, before the darkness swallowed them whole? But the lead evaporated, as all leads in this case seemed to do. Police could not prove it. The trail went cold, and the women slipped back into myth. Yet the image lingers, because it suggests something chilling, that the Springfield Three were not destroyed in one night, but held, moved, hidden, that they may have breathed, for hours, for days, maybe longer, that their silence was not death silence, but the silence of captivity, of being controlled by hands that knew exactly how to break spirit without spilling blood. And if that's true, then we are not only dealing with abduction, we are dealing with ownership, a possession of lives, a theft of identity, a transformation of free women into property of the unseen. That sighting in the garage is more than rumor. It is a glimpse into the machinery of disappearance, the industrial nature of abduction, when it moves beyond rage and becomes systemic, because captivity is not chaos. Captivity is structure. It requires places. It requires watchers. It requires silence. And that silence still hangs over Springfield, like concrete never poured, like doors never opened. The garage sighting asks a question that burns through time. Were they still alive? And if so, who controlled their fate? South of Springfield, a house stood with secrets beneath its floor. Not long after the women disappeared, the concrete in that house was freshly poured. Too fresh, too sudden, too perfectly timed. Whispers grew. That beneath that concrete lay answers. Answers no one wanted unearthed. Years later, cadaver dogs were brought in, their noses cut through time, through soil, through silence, and they alerted, not once, but repeatedly, pointing to the floor, as if truth itself was buried under stone. The families begged, the public demanded, dig it up, break the floor, set the dead free. But permission was denied. Denied. Think about that. Concrete over truth, silence over answers, law turning its eyes away, while mothers begged for their daughters back. The house still stands, its floor unbroken, its silence intact. What power protects concrete? What force values property over the possibility of 3 lives? What system decides that certainty is more dangerous than doubt? Because this is not incompetence. This is refusal, a deliberate choice to leave the question buried, and so the floor remains, like a tomb without a name, a slab of denial pressed over the cries of history. Imagine the possibility. 3 women entombed in that cement, preserved in the cold grip of stone, while the world above carries on, pretending not to feel the weight beneath its feet, or worse. Imagine that nothing lies there at all, that the floor is empty, but the refusal to check was designed to keep suspicion alive, to keep the mystery unsolved, to feed the silence. Either truth is chilling, because both reveal the same pattern. This case was not about solving. It was about stalling, not about discovery, but about denial. And every refusal, every unbroken floor, every unanswered phone call deepens the shadow that swallowed the Springfield Three. Because when institutions choose silence, they are not protecting the innocent, they are protecting themselves. And in Springfield, concrete became the final lock on a secret that was never meant to be opened. The strangest part of the disappearance isn't what was taken, it's how little was disturbed. No forced entry, no splintered wood, no shattered windows. The women didn't fight their way out. They walked into the night willingly, or at least, they opened the door. That detail changes everything, because predators do not always need masks or weapons or brute force. Sometimes, All they need is familiarity. A knock at the door, a voice they know, a request that sounds innocent enough. Can you come outside for a moment? Can I borrow something? Can I talk to you? And the women obeyed, because trust is the oldest weapon in history. The crime scene whispers of betrayal, not invasion. A hand extended in kindness, twisted into a leash of control. Think of the psychology here. 3 women of different ages, 3 different perspectives, and yet all 3 silenced at once. That requires leverage, not just physical power, but emotional power. The power of someone they believed, the power of someone who knew exactly how to stand at their door and be let in. This is why the case feels less like random violence and more like a script, a performance executed by someone who rehearsed it long before that night. Because rage leaves chaos, trust leaves silence, and silence is exactly what we are left with. Suzie, Stacy, Sherrill, did they step outside under the weight of intimidation or the comfort of recognition? Did they see danger in the eyes at their door, or only too late, when the trap was already sprung? That moment, that opening of the door, is the fracture line in the entire mystery, because on one side, they were women of ordinary lives. On the other side, they became shadows. And once shadows, they belonged no longer to Springfield, but to the unseen, to forces that live not in chaos, but in control, and betrayal was the key that unlocked the night. There is a theory that chills the bones more than death itself, that the Springfield Three did not die that night, that they were taken alive and kept alive. Captivity, not chaos, control, not slaughter, because erasure without evidence suggests time, and time suggests purpose. If the goal was simply to kill, the bodies would have been found, discarded in woods, left in rivers, unearthed by hunters or hikers decades ago. But to vanish completely, to leave nothing behind, that requires containment, walls, locks, hands that fed them, eyes that watched them, rules they were forced to obey. Picture it. 3 women trapped in an unfamiliar place, their days measured by someone else's will, their voices silenced, not by death, but by fear. How long were they kept? Days, weeks, months. No one knows. But the garage sighting, the rumors of voices in captivity, the endless silence afterward, all point toward a prison without bars, a cage carved from secrecy itself. And captivity is not random. It is structured. It is ritualistic. It is power exerted over body and spirit. Some say Suzie was the true target, that she carried knowledge, that she had seen something she was not meant to see, and that Stacy and Sherrill were simply absorbed into the punishment. Collateral silence. But captivity is never just about the target. It is about dominance. The assertion that certain people can be made to disappear, to suffer unseen, to exist only in the imagination of those who search for them. And if that is true, then the Springfield Three were not simply victims, they were examples. Warnings carved into absence, because captivity says this: we own you. We decide when you vanish, we decide if you are remembered. That is not a crime of passion. That is a doctrine, a philosophy of control. And that, more than anything, explains why. 30 years later, we are still speaking their names, into a silence that was engineered to last forever. Every crime leaves shadows, and in Springfield, those shadows pointed toward men, not strangers, not outsiders, but figures already woven into the city's quiet underworld. Suzie's circle held names tied to drugs, to violence, to men who understood the language of intimidation. One of them, a man connected to meth distribution, had already made threats, whispers that Suzie knew too much, that she had seen what she was never meant to see. Another suspect carried ties to organized crime, men who operated with hierarchy, with codes of silence, with resources to make people vanish without a ripple. Think of it. 3 women gone, no scene, no bodies, no evidence. That is not the work of an amateur. That is the work of a system that knows how to dispose, how to intimidate, how to keep law enforcement guessing while protecting its own, because police questioned these men. But questioning is not breaking, and men tied to networks do not break under simple questions. They deflect, they mislead, they wait for the trail to rot, and behind them, an institution shields their silence. Because organized crime is not just criminals. It is connections to power, to businesses, to officials, sometimes even to law itself. So the Springfield Three may not have been erased by one hand, but by many, a collaboration of silence. Suzie targeted, Sherrill and Stacy collateral, the execution carried out with resources that stretched beyond a single night. This explains the concrete floor, the refusal to dig, the endless denials, because when institutions are touched by crime, truth becomes dangerous. Too many threads, too many names, too much exposure, and so the case rotted under the weight of shadows. The suspects remained free, the families remained waiting, and Springfield remained haunted by an absence it could never name aloud. Because in crimes of power, evidence is not destroyed, it is buried under influence. And the Springfield Three became not just missing persons, but symbols of how deeply silence can be bought, and how completely truth can be erased. Silence breeds whispers, and whispers came in the form of anonymous calls, calls to police, calls to television programs, voices cloaked in secrecy, dropping fragments of truth, then vanishing back into the dark. One tip claimed the women were buried in a graveyard, their bodies concealed beneath disturbed earth, marked not by tombstones, but by secrecy. Another tip pointed to abandoned properties, isolated houses where screams could echo and no one would hear. Still others whispered of ritual, of ceremonies carried out by men who believed in power drawn from fear, power drawn from blood, and that the Springfield Three were not just victims, but offerings. The most chilling call of all came during a live television broadcast. An anonymous voice phoned in, insisting they knew where the bodies lay, giving details too precise to dismiss, too eerie to ignore. But when authorities tried to trace the call, the line went dead, the lead dissolved, and the voice was gone. Over and over, anonymous tips surfaced, each carrying a grain of possibility, each pointing toward hidden graves, concrete floors, buried truths. But each time, the trail collapsed under its own weight, as if someone were dangling fragments of the puzzle, while making sure the whole picture could never form. And that is the most unnerving possibility, that the tips were not desperate attempts to reveal the truth, but deliberate tactics to scatter it, to flood investigators with noise until the real signal was buried. Confusion is a weapon, distraction is a form of control, and in this case, both were used with surgical precision, because while families waited for answers, while the city held its breath, the phone lines rang with ghosts, whispering truths that could never be confirmed, leaving only more silence, more absence, more questions carved into the dark. Anonymous voices may have known, but anonymity was the point, because in Springfield, truth was always meant to vanish the same way the women did, without a trace. For the families, the disappearance was not a single night. It was a lifetime sentence. Sherrill's relatives, Stacy's parents, Suzie's friends, all left with questions that never hardened into answers. Imagine a mother waking every morning, wondering if her daughter is still alive somewhere, if she is eating, breathing, suffering. That kind of uncertainty is not grief. It is torture, because grief at least allows mourning. But absence is a wound that never closes, a scream that never resolves into silence. Stacy's parents described the nights as endless. Every creak in the house, every phone call after midnight, a surge of hope followed by another collapse. Suzie's friends replayed the night in their minds, as if memory itself could be rewound, as if a single detail forgotten might be the key to undo the erasure. And Sherrill's family, they carried the weight of betrayal because the woman who spent her life building a home vanished from it, as if home itself had turned traitor. The toll went beyond the families. It seeped into the community, into Springfield's streets and storefronts, a paranoia that spread like fog. People locked doors earlier, watched strangers longer, trusted less. Because if 3 women could vanish without a trace, then safety was an illusion, and every home could be a stage for disappearance. But the cruelest part was the sense of nearness, the feeling that the women were not gone, but hidden, that somewhere close enough to touch, they still breathed, and yet no one could reach them. That psychological limbo, that eternal almost, broke more minds than death ever could, because to lose someone is pain, but to lose them into silence, to absence, to erasure, that is a horror that eats you alive slowly, day after day, night after night, until the only thing you believe in is the cruelty of uncertainty. And Springfield has been breathing that uncertainty for over 30 years. When investigators finally stepped into 1717 East Delmar, the crime scene was already ruined. Friends and family had walked through the house, touched counters, moved objects, even cleaned up the broken glass on the porch light, unknowingly erasing fingerprints, destroying the silent testimony of the crime itself. The first hours of an investigation decide everything. But Springfield police stumbled from the start. They did not seal the house. They did not treat it like a crime scene. They allowed contamination. And once evidence is gone, it is gone forever. Neighbors reported a scream in the early hours. Another claimed to see a strange man by Suzie's car at dawn. But those accounts were not pursued with urgency. They were filed, forgotten, left to rot in paperwork. Then came the phone calls, the obscene, disturbing voice that rang into the house. While friends were still searching for the women, those calls were never traced, never recorded. No urgency was placed on the possibility that the caller might have been the one who silenced them. What does that reveal? Negligence or protection, because incompetence explains mistakes. But this was not one mistake. It was a chain, a collapse of procedure at every step, almost as if the investigation was never meant to succeed. Some officers whispered about political pressure, about certain names not being touched, about connections that ran too deep into Springfield's own veins. Others chalked it up to small-town policing, undertrained, under-equipped, unable to face the precision of whoever planned the disappearance. But whether by design or by weakness, the result was the same. The trail went cold within days, and the women were gone, not just from life, but from justice. When the system that promises truth delivers only silence, that silence becomes its own kind of confession, because law enforcement did not just fail the Springfield Three. They buried them a second time, under paperwork, under incompetence, under secrets. And that is why this case feels less like an unsolved mystery and more like a locked box, guarded not by time, but by hands that refuse to open it. Every disappearance leaves shadows, and in Springfield, those shadows had names. The first was personal. Suzie Streeter's ex-boyfriend, obsessive, controlling. The kind of man who believed leaving him was an act of war. Friends whispered about his temper, his threats, his eyes that did not forgive. But obsession alone does not explain 3 vanishings in silence. The second shadow was darker. Suzie had been connected to a criminal case, a scheme involving stolen vehicles. She was expected to testify. She knew things that certain men wanted buried, and what better way to bury a witness than to erase her life completely and silence anyone who stood beside her. Which brings us to Robert Craig Cox, a man whose very name drips with menace, a convicted kidnapper, a suspected killer, a predator who prowled in plain sight. He lived in Springfield during the summer of 1992. He worked nearby, and he fit the profile too perfectly. Years later, Cox spoke with smug certainty. He said the Springfield Three were dead. He said their bodies would never be found. He refused to say more. Was he bluffing, taunting, feeding on the pain of families, desperate for answers? Or was he confessing in riddles, secure in the knowledge that the truth was too dangerous to reveal? When pressed, he smiled. He always smiled, like a man holding a secret too powerful to ever share. And that is what makes him terrifying, because he spoke with the confidence of someone who knew, not guessed, not speculated, knew. Was he involved, or was he a vulture, circling tragedy, drawing power from it? The police never proved his role, but they never disproved it either. And so Cox remains, not the only suspect, but the loudest shadow in a gallery of men who circled too close to 3 women that summer. Men who believed power was theirs to take, and silence was theirs to enforce. Springfield is full of whispers, but the whispers always circle back to control, to intimidation, to the kind of men who think disappearance is cleaner than blood. And in 1992, 3 women learned that some men in the shadows do not make threats. They make people vanish. Robert Craig Cox did not fade into obscurity. He fed on it. Behind prison walls, he became the specter of the Springfield case, speaking in half-truths, dripping poison into the ears of reporters and investigators alike. He told one journalist, the women were dead. Their bodies would never be found. And when asked how he knew, he leaned back, smiled, and said it wasn't the right time to tell. It was not a denial. It was not a plea for attention. It was certainty, the kind of certainty only the guilty or the deeply connected could carry. Cox thrived on control, and nothing is more controlling than dangling truth in front of grieving families, then snatching it away. Every word he spoke felt calculated, designed not to solve the mystery, but to twist the knife of uncertainty deeper. Detectives tried to break him, tried to drag specifics out of him. But he never wavered. He played a long game, a game of power, because in his mind, information was currency. And the Springfield Three were his vault. Was he the architect of the disappearance, or merely an insider who heard whispers from men higher up the chain? The ambiguity was the weapon. It made him untouchable. And so the families were left staring at a monster who might hold their answers, but who would never trade them. Not for justice, not for peace, not for anything. Cox once said, "If you ever find the bodies, you'll know I'm telling the truth." But decades later, no bodies have surfaced, and Cox still sits in silence, an executioner without a weapon in hand, but with blood on his words. In his refusal, you hear the deeper truth, that this crime was designed to vanish into silence, not to be solved, not to be uncovered, but to remain a ghost story written in human flesh. And Cox, whether mastermind or messenger, became its keeper, the man who knew and would never let go. In the days and weeks after the vanishing, Springfield was alive with whispers of sightings. At a local parking garage, 2 young women were seen, escorted by an older man, their faces pale, their posture stiff. They looked afraid. They looked silent. To some, they looked exactly like Suzie and Stacy. The witness hesitated. By the time police checked, there were no cameras, no proof, no names. Just a fleeting glimpse, swallowed by time. Another report surfaced along the highway. A woman at a rest stop, pacing nervously near the payphones. Her description, too close to ignore. Her silence, even louder. But by the time investigators arrived, she was gone, and so was the trail. Gas stations, shopping malls, even whispers from out of state. Women who resembled the missing 3 women who seemed on the edge of escape or the edge of despair. Each report was Hope dressed as a stranger, and each report collapsed under scrutiny because none of them could be confirmed. Not one. And yet, the sightings never stopped. It was as if the Springfield Three had become phantoms, projecting themselves into the eyes of the desperate, haunting every crowd, every shadowed parking lot, every flicker of memory that might have been mistaken for reality. Were these women truly seen, dragged through towns by captors? Or was it the mind's way of refusing to accept silence? The truth is harder to face, that if they were alive in those early days, they were hidden well, controlled tightly, stripped of freedom and voice, because silence is not just an absence, it is enforced. And if the sightings held truth, then somewhere in the shadows of Missouri or beyond, 3 women were still breathing, still waiting, still shackled by fear. But hope is a cruel master. It dangles salvation, and then rots into disappointment. Every lead that dissolved, every phantom sighting, only deepened the torment, because false hope is not lighter than grief. It is heavier. It drags the soul lower until you no longer know what to believe. And Springfield learned that lesson again and again until hope itself became the enemy. Years after the disappearance, a new lead surfaced, one that carried the weight of finality. A house south of Springfield, ordinary on the outside, but inside, a concrete floor poured suspiciously fresh. In the very days after the women vanished, neighbors whispered. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate. Police brought cadaver dogs, and the dogs alerted. They signaled human scent beneath the slab. For a moment, it felt like the silence was about to crack, like the ground itself was ready to speak. But then, the investigation stopped. Permission to dig was denied. The concrete remained untouched. The floor sealed its secret deeper. Why? Why would a lead so strong, so visceral, be left buried? Was it property rights? Was it red tape? Or was it something darker? A decision to let silence stand, because breaking that concrete might reveal truths. Too heavy, too connected, too dangerous. And so the floor still sits, a tomb without a marker, a prison for whispers. Every year that passes, the possibility grows colder, the truth hardens. Not just in cement, but in silence. Families beg for excavation, investigators shrug, and the house becomes more than a house. It becomes a symbol of how truth is treated in America. Buried under layers of concrete, beneath legal refusal, beneath systemic indifference. The dogs knew something. The timing screamed of guilt. But evidence without excavation is nothing. And nothing is exactly what the Springfield Three have been given. That house, that floor, that refusal to look beneath. It is the clearest sign that this case was never about finding answers. It was about protecting silence. And silence is the most dangerous accomplice of all. The question that lingers like smoke is this: how were 3 women removed from their home, without sound, without struggle, without a trace? Look closer. And the answer is not force. It is trust. because doors do not open that quietly for strangers. Not at night, not in a quiet neighborhood. The women either knew who knocked, or they recognized enough authority in the presence to comply without hesitation. A familiar voice, a trusted face, a badge, a uniform, a man who knew how to command obedience without raising suspicion. That is how silence begins, not with violence, but with recognition. Fear may paralyze, but trust disarms. Once the threshold was crossed, the psychology of control took over. 3 women, 3 separate identities, but suddenly unified under one weapon, one order, one threat strong enough to keep them silent. Think about it. No overturned chairs, no broken dishes, no cries for help loud enough to wake the neighbors. That is not chaos. That is precision. And precision means planning. This was not an impulsive crime. This was orchestrated. The abductor or abductors knew the layout of the house, knew the routines, knew exactly how to move 3 women without leaving a mark behind. That level of control is not random. It suggests training. It suggests hierarchy. It suggests someone accustomed to power and accustomed to silencing those who resist. And so, the real terror is not just the abduction itself, but the invisible structure behind it. Because to make 3 women vanish cleanly, you need more than opportunity. You need system. You need protection. You need a machine designed to erase. And once that machine is in motion, no evidence survives. No voices remain. Only absence. The Springfield 3 did not simply disappear. They were absorbed into a system of silence, a system older and darker than one suburban street. And that is why this case does not feel like chance. It feels like design. When a crime is too clean, too silent, you must ask yourself, who benefits from that silence? The Springfield 3 did not vanish in chaos. They were removed with surgical precision. And precision often carries the fingerprints of institutions, because only institutions have the resources, the reach, the authority to erase without leaving residue. Suzie was tied to testimony in a criminal case, a case with men connected to networks larger than Springfield. If she talked, it meant exposure. If she vanished, it meant preservation. And preservation is the instinct of systems built on power. But what if it went deeper? What if the abduction was not simply the work of one bitter man, but a favor executed for those who could not risk exposure? Law enforcement mistakes, so many, so constant, begin to look less like incompetence and more like design. Obscene phone calls never traced, leads dismissed before they were followed. A house with cadaver dog alerts left untouched, concrete sealed forever without excavation. Ask yourself, is that failure or protection? Because silence is currency for those in power. And the Springfield 3 may have been a transaction. 3 lives, traded for the preservation of a structure too big to challenge. This is the part no one wants to speak aloud, that the women may not have been victims of random violence, but casualties of order, of a hidden arrangement that uses erasure the way others use bullets. And once a system erases you, you do not return. You do not reappear. You become an empty file, a missing poster yellowed with age, a cold case waiting room where families sit until they die. And the system remains intact, stronger, because it has shown what it can do. Silence is its weapon, and the Springfield 3 were its message. The question is not only who took them, but who allowed it to remain buried. And that question is the one Springfield has never been permitted to answer. The Springfield 3 were not the first to vanish into silence, and they will not be the last, because America itself has a history of erasure, a pattern older than the nation's laws, a system designed not only to kill, but to erase. as if the person never existed at all. Think about it. Entire towns wiped from maps, native tribes forced into silence, records burned, witnesses disappeared, files sealed until no one remembered the names. The blueprint is ancient. If you control the evidence, you control the story. If you erase the body, you erase the crime, and Springfield was simply another execution of that design. 3 women, living in an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, swallowed into the same machinery that once swallowed entire communities. And the method is always the same: precision, silence, absence, because blood leaves stains. But disappearance leaves nothing to clean and nothing to prove. This is the kind of power institutions crave. The power not just to kill, but to unmake. That is why the Springfield case feels different. It doesn't feel like crime. It feels like ritual, a performance of control, a demonstration that the system decides who is remembered and who is erased. Ask yourself, how many other disappearances sit in dusty files? How many families sit in limbo, wondering if their loved ones were not just victims, but examples, lessons, warnings? The Springfield Three became folklore in Missouri, but folklore is just history stripped of evidence. And that is exactly what institutions want, because absence becomes myth, and myth never convicts anyone. So this isn't just the story of 3 women. It is the story of how America deals with inconvenient lives, not by confronting them, but by removing them, and then covering the ground with concrete so no one can dig deeper. It is a cycle, one that repeats through centuries. And if you look closely, Springfield is not an outlier. It is a mirror. For the families, the silence was not empty. It was a prison. Every day became a ritual of questions. Every night, an autopsy of memory. Did we miss something? Did we trust the wrong person? Did we ignore the warning signs? Stacy's parents described the waiting as torture. They said it felt like drowning, except instead of water, it was uncertainty pressing on their lungs. Suzie's friends would sit in her empty room, surrounded by photos, clothes still folded, perfume bottles still full, as if she had just stepped out, as if she might walk back in. But she never did, and Sherrill's relatives carried a heavier shadow, because mothers are supposed to protect daughters. Yet Sherrill vanished beside her child. Her very presence, her very instinct to protect, could not stop the machinery that came for them all. That guilt seeped into every conversation, every holiday, every prayer whispered into a silence that never answered. But the pain was not confined to bloodlines. Springfield itself transformed. Neighbors double-locked their doors. Parents warned their daughters not to answer the phone, not to go out at night, not to trust the familiar. The city carried a phantom. Every corner, every quiet street became a possible grave. And the longer the silence lasted, the heavier it grew, until the entire community felt complicit, haunted not just by what happened, but by what they failed to uncover. Because absence is not passive, it is active. It gnaws, it corrodes, it reshapes a city's psychology, until Springfield was no longer a place of safety, but a place of warning. And in that transformation, the Springfield Three became more than victims. They became symbols. Symbols of how fragile trust really is. Symbols of how quickly the familiar can turn fatal. Symbols of how silence is not the end of a crime. It is the continuation of it. And the city has been serving that sentence for over 3 decades. You may think this story belongs to Springfield, that it is locked in the past, a nightmare contained within the borders of Missouri. But silence does not respect borders, and erasure is not bound by time. The same machinery that swallowed the Springfield Three still operates today. More refined, more subtle, more efficient. Every city has its own ghosts, cases that never reach trial, files that gather dust, families that are told to stop asking questions, and the same excuses echo across decades. Insufficient evidence, too many suspects, a lack of resources. But what if those excuses are masks? What if they are designed to condition you to accept disappearance as natural, as inevitable, as ordinary? Because once you accept silence, you stop resisting it, and that is when power thrives. Look at your own neighborhood, your own city. Are there names you only hear in whispers, faces on posters that never came home, stories that vanish from the news, long before answers ever arrived? That is not coincidence, that is pattern, and here is the truth no one tells you. The Springfield Three are not just victims you watch from a distance. They are a warning that erasure is possible anywhere, to anyone at any time. The system does not need your permission. It only needs your silence, and silence is something it has already trained you to give. So the question becomes, not just what happened to Suzie, to Stacy, to Sherrill. The question becomes, what happens when the system decides it is your turn? When your voice becomes inconvenient, when your presence becomes a liability, will you notice the machinery moving before it reaches your door? Or will you only feel it? When silence is all that remains. Silence is not absence. It is strategy. It is the weapon of systems that cannot afford witnesses, cannot afford accountability, cannot afford truth. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Look at Springfield. The investigation strangled by its own silence, tips dismissed, evidence ignored, excavations denied. Each failure was not just incompetence, it was reinforcement, a reminder to the families, to the city, to the nation, that the system decides when answers are given, and when they are not. This is how control works, not with open threats, but with the slow suffocation of truth. Because silence breaks people in ways violence never could. A bullet ends a life, but silence stretches the wound across decades until it eats entire families alive, until it poisons entire communities. And yet, the system thrives on this poison, because the longer the silence continues, the more it conditions obedience. Families become exhausted, communities grow numb, the public loses interest, and the missing fade from urgency into folklore. That is the endgame, not justice, not closure, but erasure dressed as mystery. And the Springfield Three are the clearest example. 3 women stolen from their home, and 3 decades later, their names are spoken not with certainty, but with doubt, with speculation, with whispers. That is victory for the system, because speculation replaces truth, myth replaces fact, and silence replaces evidence. And if you can make silence powerful enough, it becomes permanent. That is the kind of control only institutions crave. The power not to protect, not to serve, but to erase. And once you understand that, you see the Springfield case for what it really is. Not an unsolved crime, but a demonstration. A demonstration of silence as domination. A demonstration of power disguised as absence. A demonstration of how systems train you to accept the unthinkable until you do not even question it anymore. The Springfield Three are not just names on missing posters. They are symbols, markers carved into the dark history of America, because this country has always known how to disappear its inconvenient, how to silence the ones who saw too much, how to erase the ones who threatened the story, from villages wiped off maps, to witnesses who never reached the courtroom, to mothers and daughters erased in one night. The pattern is uninterrupted. Springfield is not an exception. It is a continuation. 3 women pulled from their home with no signs of resistance. No cries heard, no bodies recovered, only the echo of absence. That is not chaos, that is choreography. And choreography points to structure, to a machine bigger than one man, bigger than one crime, because to erase so cleanly, so permanently, requires more than cruelty. It requires design. And design is the signature of systems. That is why Springfield feels less like a mystery and more like a message to every witness who thinks of speaking, a message to every family who dares to demand truth, a message to every city that believes itself safe. The message is this: we can take anyone, at any time, and leave nothing behind. That is why the Springfield Three matter, not just because of what was taken from them, but because of what was revealed to us. They are not simply missing. They are evidence of a hidden order that thrives in silence. Evidence that disappearance is not random. It is policy. It is tradition. It is the dark rhythm beneath the surface of this nation. And if you listen closely, if you strip away the noise of rumor and speculation, you will hear it, the same rhythm, repeating across history, repeating across cities, repeating across families still waiting for answers. The Springfield Three did not vanish into nothing. They were folded into that rhythm, into that machinery of silence, and that rhythm is still playing today. Listen closely now, because this is where the story stops being theirs and starts becoming yours. Silence is not just a weapon used on the Springfield Three. It is being used on you, right now, every day. The unanswered questions, the censored truths, the stories that vanish from headlines before you can ask why. That is not coincidence, that is conditioning. You are being trained to accept erasure as natural, to shrug when files go missing, to yawn when witnesses vanish, to scroll past names on missing posters, as if they are background noise. That indifference is the system's masterpiece, because the less you demand answers, the more silence it can feed you. And the more silence you accept, the stronger the system becomes. The Springfield Three are a warning carved in shadow. They show you what happens when silence is allowed to reign unchecked. 3 women, living in a house no different from yours, gone by morning, no trace, no answers, no closure. And the machine that consumed them is still humming, still searching for the next life to erase, the next family to break, the next community to paralyze. You are not outside of this story, you are inside it. Every unanswered question in your own world is proof. Ask yourself, what has already been hidden from you? What names have already been scrubbed from your memory? What truths have already been buried under concrete? The Springfield Three are not just missing. They are the mirror the system does not want you to face. And when you look into it, you will see yourself. You will see your family. You will see your city, because silence has no boundaries. And once it takes root, it grows everywhere. The question is not if the system will reach for you. The question is whether you will see it coming, or whether you will only notice when the silence has already closed in. And so we arrive at the end, but there is no end, because the Springfield Three are still gone. No bodies, no graves, no justice, only absence. An absence so heavy, it has become part of the air itself. A shadow stitched into Springfield, a warning etched into America. You have walked through their story. You have seen the patterns, the precision, the silence. And now you must face the truth, that silence does not fade. It multiplies, it lingers, it waits. The Springfield Three are not ghosts trapped in the past. They are reminders in the present. Reminders that erasure is possible, that disappearance is a tool, that silence is a weapon. When you lie in bed tonight, when the house is still, when every creak of wood sounds louder than it should, remember they were in their home too, a place that should have been safe, until safety itself was revealed as an illusion. And remember this, silence is not passive, it is alive, it is listening. The Springfield Three were consumed by it, and now it hangs over you, because cases like this are never just about the missing, they are about the living, they are about you. And if the system could erase 3 women from a suburban street in Missouri, without struggle, without trace, without consequence, then what makes you believe it could not happen again, to someone you know, to someone you love, to you? That is the legacy of the Springfield Three. Not an ending, but a question. A question that will follow you long after this story ends. A question that will whisper to you in the dark. Do you hear the silence now? And will you recognize it before it recognizes you?